Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about Rene Descartes, who is a major figure of the Enlightenment, of the Dutch Golden Age, of the Scientific Revolution, of probably some other names that people use for certain periods of history. He's a very important thinker. He's one of these rare guys who has both written about a way of thinking or a way of living, or wrote something about life, wrote something that we would today call philosophy, but also demonstrated the power of his method by making significant discoveries having to do with optics, meteorology, and geometry. He is best known for inventing what we today call the coordinate grid, or Cartesian coordinates. They're named after him. And that effectively connected algebra to geometry and led to what we today call analytic geometry. And as we'll see, he even says that in his writing, that he has this method that he describes, and he says, and there's much that I was able to get from this method, and that shows the strength of it. To just briefly talk about his life, Descartes was born to a wealthy family. His mother was pretty wealthy, and his father was a politician in the Parliament of Brittany, which was a province of France at the time. I'm not sure if it still is. And he was it would be sort of like the state senate or something for that province. And so for that reason, Descartes mostly didn't have to work throughout his life, which obviously freed him up to work on other things, and he clearly used that time very well. Again, like Milton, there are plenty of other people who are in those circumstances and then never do anything valuable with it. So though it may seem sort of like having a cheat code to be born into such a rich family and to be able to do such work, still doesn't mean that it's a given that you will, or even if that you do, that you'll find anything unusual. So when he was younger, he went to a school where he studied philosophy and math, probably when he was about 10 to about 18. And that was more or less a typical education for somebody of his class at the time. And then afterwards, he joined the military because he wanted to be a military officer. And when he was there, he got some training in military engineering and learned how to build fortifications and things like that. And then he got out a couple years later and decided that he wanted to dedicate his life to what we would call philosophy and mathematics. He then spent the next several decades writing books and making discoveries and recording them. And then when he was in his 50s, he was invited to Sweden by Queen Christina. This is the second and last book on this podcast that I have read before that I will be talking about. And that's just because, like Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Sextus Empiricus, I thought that this book is just so important, and Descartes in general, but particularly Discourse on Method, is just so important that I couldn't make this podcast without taking the opportunity to tell you about it, because really it's been very valuable for me. But when I first read this book a few years ago, I looked into how Descartes died, and the general history that has been given is that he traveled to Stockholm to tutor Queen Christina, and that he got sick while he was there. He got pneumonia or something similar and died. And there are apparently some other theories that he might have been poisoned, but I didn't really look into that. But what I know now, after having read a book about the 30 Years' War, is that Queen Christina was the daughter of great Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus, that when he died in the 30 Years' War, his daughter then took over. And on the one hand, she's sort of an interesting historical figure that I'd like to know more about, because she put some effort into gathering the enlightened people of the day to Stockholm, to Sweden, to try to make Sweden more intellectually developed than it was at the time. And she herself was interested in science and art and things like that. But she also apparently sort of mismanaged the kingdom, and she abdicated when she was 28 or something. And now I know that she also has on her CV that she's the one who maybe indirectly led to the premature death of Descartes, because he was, as I said, 50, in his mid-50s when he died, and he probably could very well have gone on another 30 years if he hadn't gone to Stockholm. And also given her tutoring lessons in the early morning in Stockholm. So it wasn't even enough that he just be in a cold place during the day. He was waking up early in the morning, and they think that that might be what killed him. And Descartes, though he was a military officer, he was in the military for a couple years, he was known to have had sort of a fragile constitution. So Descartes was born in 1596 in France, in a town that is now named after him, though it wasn't when he was born, because that would be weird. And he died in 1650, I just looked it up, in Stockholm, so he was 53 years old. And this book that we're going to be looking at today was published in 1637, which was amid the 30 Years' War, which was from 1618 to 1648. And I'm always happy and amazed to see people producing great art and making important discoveries, even amid very difficult circumstances like that, though I'm not sure how close he was to the front in 1637. He probably wasn't very near it at all. There are some reports that Descartes, in his experiments, treated animals pretty badly, not just for fun, but because he believed that animals didn't have souls and therefore could not feel pain. If he did this, it's obviously terrible. And what it shows is the dangers of how an excessive belief in what you think you know, in this case, for example, that animals don't have souls and don't feel pain, can make you do something terrible, which is only an even better reason to adhere to what Descartes teaches in this book, even though he couldn't always stick to it. Another thing you will notice if you read Discourse on Method in full, or Meditations on First Philosophy, or Principles of Philosophy for that matter, is that Descartes both had a very rigorous view of what he thought he knew. He had a very stringent test to which he put any thought that occurred to him. He was also a devout Catholic, and his efforts to reconcile these two opposing forces in his mind are, to me, not very convincing, but he wrote about them at length, and his Christianity might be what made him think that animals don't have a soul, since that is Christian doctrine. He also wrote a book called The World, which has most of his philosophical view in it, as well as metaphysics and physics and biology. But just as he was about to publish it, the Roman Inquisition convicted Galileo of heresy, or suspicion of heresy, and sentenced him to house arrest. So Descartes put off publishing his book, which also rested on the heliocentric view of the universe. He put it off publishing it for a while. And I was interested to learn that he discussed this issue with his friend Rene Descartes, who is known as the father of acoustics. He's another French mathematician, but he especially dealt with math as it relates to sound and music. And I didn't realize that they were friends, Mersenne and Descartes. Parts of The World were used in Principles of Philosophy, which was 1644, and then the rest of it was published in 1664 after Descartes had died, and then all together as one book in 1677. Descartes also wrote a treatise on fencing and was apparently an accomplished swordsman, but the treatise has been lost. Now we can get into some passages from Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences. This treatise was first published in 1637, as I mentioned, and though it's often shortened, abbreviated to Discourse on Method or Discourse on the Method, I think it would be much better abbreviated to Conducting One's Reason or Seeking Truth in the Sciences or Rightly Conducting One's Reason. Those would be equally good abbreviations, equally short, that would better describe what the book is actually about. Discourse on Method could be about anything. Relatively early on in Discourse on Method, he writes, quote, "Good sense is, of all things among men, the most equally distributed. For everyone thinks himself so abundantly provided with it, that those even who are the most difficult to satisfy in everything else do not usually desire a larger measure of this quality than they already possess. And in this it is not likely that all are mistaken. The conviction is rather to be held as testifying that the power of judging aright and of distinguishing truth from error, which is properly what is called good sense or reason, is by nature equal in all men, and that the diversity of our opinions consequently does not arise from some being endowed with a larger share of reason than others, but solely from this, that we conduct our thoughts along different ways and do not fix our attention on the same objects. For to be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is rightly to apply it. The greatest minds, as they are capable of the highest excellences, are open likewise to the greatest aberrations, and those who travel very slowly may yet make far greater progress, provided they keep always to the straight road, than those who, while they run, forsake it." End quote. So in that passage, first he says that good sense is equally distributed among men, and the evidence of this is that everybody feels like they have good sense, and that they don't need more of it. Then he specifically says that rather than everyone being wrong about this, it's probably the case that our ability to judge truth from error when it's clear is equal in all men, in all people. But we have many different opinions because we use our minds differently and we conduct our thoughts along different ways and do not fix our attention on the same subjects. That we spend our time thinking about different things, and that's how we end up at different conclusions often. And that the best way to think is to stay on the right path of thought and go slowly. Because if you start running, you might end up going flying off the path. But if you go slowly, you might have a chance of staying on the right path. He then writes, quote, "I will not hesitate, however, to avow my belief that it has been my singular good fortune to have very early in life fallen in with certain tracks which have conducted me to considerations and maxims, of which I formed a method that gives me the means, as I think, of gradually augmenting my knowledge and of raising it by little and little to the highest point, which the mediocrity of my talents and the brief duration of my life will permit me to reach. For I have already reaped from it such fruits that although I have been accustomed to think lowly enough of myself, and although when I look with the eye of a philosopher at the varied courses and pursuits of mankind at large, I find scarcely one which does not appear in vain and useless, I nevertheless derive the highest satisfaction from the progress I conceive myself to have already made in the search after truth, and cannot help entertaining such expectations of the future as to believe that if, among the occupations of men as men, there is any one really excellent and important, it is that which I have chosen. After all, it is possible I may be mistaken, and it is but a little copper and glass, perhaps, that I take for gold and diamonds." End quote. So there he is reflecting on the power of this method that he has devised. And even at the end, he says that maybe he's mistaken about the value of his method, and it's just a bit of copper and glass that he takes for gold and diamonds, which is itself an application of his method, as we'll see. He says that his purpose is not to tell people what to think or even how to think, but just to say what has worked for him. He says, quote, "My present design, then, is not to teach the method which each ought to follow for the right conduct of his reason, but solely to describe the way in which I have endeavored to conduct my own." End quote. And though he does sometimes rip on book learning, he takes the view, at least in part, that we have on this podcast. He writes, quote, "that the perusal of all excellent books is, as it were, to interview with the noblest men of past ages who have written them, and even a studied interview in which are discovered to us only their choicest thoughts." End quote. I've often had the same thought that reading a book written by somebody from the past would be even more valuable than being able to meet and speak with them, because anybody, when they're speaking, is maybe a little bit less concise and concentrated than they are in their writing. He writes, quote, "To hold converse with those of other ages and to travel are almost the same thing. It is useful to know something of the manners of different nations, that we may be enabled to form a more correct judgment regarding our own, and be prevented from thinking that everything contrary to our customs is ridiculous and irrational, a conclusion usually come to by those whose experience has been limited to their own country. On the other hand, when too much time is occupied in traveling, we become strangers to our native country, and the over-curious in the customs of the past are generally ignorant of those of the present." End quote. I've often thought that a book is a poor man's plane ticket, that if you can't go travel somewhere, then you can just buy a book and it's almost the same thing. And often it's better, because you will get knowledge from the book that it might take you years to get from even living in a place. Though conversely, there are things that you will learn in the first few weeks of living in a place that you might never learn from a book, or it would take a long time to learn from a book. And even then you would learn it imperfectly. And of course he's right that spending time among other cultures helps us to see more clearly what is sensible and insensible about our own culture, because you can notice in the other culture there are certain things that make sense and maybe are even better than the way that your culture does something. And there are other things that maybe don't quite make as much sense, but the people there have gotten used to doing it that way. And so it then takes on the disguise of being what makes sense when really it's just what's familiar. And I also like that line, when too much time is occupied in traveling, we become strangers to our native country. I traveled a fair amount in my 20s, and I learned a lot about the history and culture of some other places, and I took my own culture and history a bit for granted, and I didn't really develop my knowledge of it. So a lot of my knowledge of it sort of stayed the way that it was maybe in high school. I spent all this time learning Turkish and studying Middle Eastern politics and culture and history, and I neglected European history. I've corrected that more recently, but that's part of what I'm trying to do on this podcast, and to maybe help you do the same. He then writes, quote, I was especially delighted with the mathematics on account of the certitude and evidence of their reasonings, but I had not as yet a precise knowledge of their true use, and thinking that they but contributed to the advancement of the mechanical arts, I was astonished that foundations so strong and solid should have had no loftier superstructure reared on them. On the other hand, I compared the disquisitions of the ancient moralists to very towering and magnificent palaces with no better foundation than sand and mud. They laud the virtues very highly, and exhibit them as estimable far above anything on earth, but they give us no adequate criterion of virtue, and frequently that which they designate with so fine a name is but apathy, or pride, or despair, or parricide. End quote. I came to a very similar conclusion separately in my late 20s, and when I read that Descartes thought the same thing, I was even more fired up about it. I was terrible at math when I was in high school. I stopped at like pre-calculus or something. And so when I, in my late 20s, got interested in math again and decided that it was a way forward for certain subjects in politics that I'm interested in, I said, well, I'll just pick up where I left off. This is sort of a side anecdote. And so I started doing some pre-calculus. I found some websites to practice online. And I realized I didn't remember how to do a lot of this stuff. So I said, oh, well, I'll back it up a little bit and do some algebra too. And there were aspects of that I didn't understand or remember. So I said, well, I guess I need some geometry. And then when I was looking at geometry, there were things in that I didn't understand. So I had to go all the way back to algebra 1. And I started over and I went through algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2, pre-calculus, and now I'm wrapping up calculus finally, which in high school I never studied any calculus. So I'm very happy that I've taken this long road, at least through these basic math concepts, so that now hopefully I can keep going on into bigger and more interesting things. But when I read this passage from Descartes, I felt like, he saw the same thing that I did, and that many other people see, which is that these ancient philosophers, and I like them as much as anybody. I have several podcast episodes already about them, and I'll probably have more. Greek philosophers, but others also. And even modern philosophers can be described this way to a certain extent. The knowledge that they aspire to or assert does not match with what they can demonstrate often. Whereas with mathematics, the beauty of it is that everything is just crystal clear. It's complicated. It's actually not even that complicated. It's a lot of small components. And if you get all the components, you get the whole thing. But it looks complicated if you don't understand it. But a foreign language looks complicated if you don't understand that, and you just have to learn the language. But if we're looking for certain knowledge, if we're looking for something that we can build on, something that we actually know, to which we can add a little bit more, 1 little gram at a time, 1 little ounce at a time, that we actually know, the place to start from has to be mathematics, because it's just so much more certain than the word games that you can get tangled in what's traditionally called philosophy. And I say that as somebody whose background is not in mathematics. I'm learning mathematics as an adult, basically, and I love it. But this is not a situation where I'm advocating for what I can do best. I'm advocating actually for what I hardly can do at all, and what I've spent very little time on. And the thing that I've spent the most time on is languages and facts and qualitative rather than quantitative information. And I also would never say that we should all just study math all the time, because there's all kinds of things that math and science, I think, largely cannot answer, or cannot answer in their current form. Questions about, for example, how does a society or a culture or a civilization thrive or fail? This is a question that mathematics really cannot answer yet, though maybe it will be able to someday. A very hard mathematical science of politics and sociology. And so in the meantime, We have to answer these questions qualitatively based on linear logic, cause and effect, our desired outcomes, how to achieve those outcomes. And fortunately, Descartes' treatise here is mostly about that, as we will see soon. Descartes writes, quote, "Of philosophy I will say nothing, except that when I saw that it had been cultivated for many ages by the most distinguished men, and that yet there is not a single matter within its sphere which is not still in dispute, and nothing, therefore, which is above doubt, I did not presume to anticipate that my success would be greater in it than that of others. And further, when I considered the number of conflicting opinions touching a single matter that may be upheld by learned men, while there can be but one true, I reckoned as well nigh false all that was only probable. As to the other sciences, inasmuch as these borrow their principles from philosophy, I judged that no solid superstructures could be reared on foundations so infirm, and neither the honor nor the gain held out by them was sufficient to determine me to their cultivation, for I was not, thank heaven, in a condition which compelled me to make merchandise of science for the bettering of my fortune, and though I might not profess to scorn glory as a cynic, I yet made very slight account of that honor which I hoped to acquire only through fictitious titles. And, in fine, of false sciences I thought I knew the worth sufficiently to escape being deceived by the professions of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the impostures of a magician, or by the artifices and boasting of any of those who profess to know things of which they are ignorant." End quote. That's an important phrase that is still very useful today. By the artifices and boasting of any of those who profess to know things of which they are ignorant. There are lots of people out there who pretend to know things on various topics of which they are ignorant. There was just some further commentary on why he doesn't value philosophy so highly, though he doesn't throw it out, and he says that later, that everything that they talk about, there's a learned position on all sides of all of it, and there's no conclusions that can be drawn, and nothing that can be said, this is above doubt. He then points out how the other sciences at that time were largely based on philosophy. And for that reason, he did not go into them because he did not want to do it just for money. He wanted to be working on something that he really thought was true. Talking about what he wanted to do, he writes, quote, "In addition, I had always a most earnest desire to know how to distinguish the true from the false, in order that I may be able to clearly discriminate the right path in life and proceed in it with confidence." End quote. That is a concern that is directly connected to the Samuel Johnson tale that we were looking at last week, the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, in which in the whole story they're trying to figure out what the best path in life is. Here, Descartes is saying that he wanted to be able to tell the true from the false so that he could know what the best life was. And that's part of why reading philosophy and thinking about these kinds of issues is a topic for everybody, really, not just for a group of people with a specialized interest in something, because we all live. Everybody's here living. We're all living this human life. And you can either live the life that you're sort of thrown into and that gradually unfolds in front of you without thinking about it very much, which is what most people do. Or you can try to think about it and try to direct your life consciously in a way that would be both honorable and enjoyable and profitable for the people around you and for yourself. But in order to do that, you have to know what's true and what's false. Otherwise, you have no ability to make any judgment about anything being any better than anything else. So these questions of epistemology, and that's a word that, for me also, until my late 20s, I didn't think much about that word, is not an esoteric and arcane subsection of philosophy. It's one of, if not the first question you have to answer in order to live your life in a deliberate and examined way. He later writes, quote, "The greatest advantage I derived from the study consisted in this, that observing many things, which however extravagant and ridiculous to our apprehension, are yet by common consent received and approved by other great nations, I learned to entertain too decided a belief in regard to nothing of the truth of which I had been persuaded merely by example and custom, and thus I gradually extricated myself from many errors powerful enough to darken our natural intelligence and incapacitate us in great measure from listening to reason." End quote. This passage made me pause because, on the one hand, it's absolutely true. There are all kinds of things that are just a custom rather than a truth. We think that they're true just because we've always thought that they were true, and our parents thought they were true, and their parents thought they were true. And you have to examine those things and make sure that they're true. And at the time that Descartes was writing, this was even more the case. There were even more things that were unexamined customs that were governing society, and there were fewer things that had been newly established as practices based on reason and science and logic. Now, the problem is that this thought, this need to examine customs, has morphed into a reflex against custom or tradition, to the extent that now many people will favor a new practice over an old one purely for the reason that it's new, and it can masquerade as being an overturning of an invalid custom, when really it's no more valid and maybe is less valid than what it's replacing. But because it's newer, it has an advantage. Here, Descartes describes one of the projects of his life. Quote, "And because we have all to pass through a state of infancy to manhood, and have been of necessity for a length of time governed by our desires and preceptors, whose dictates were frequently conflicting, while neither perhaps always counseled us for the best, I farther concluded that it is almost impossible that our judgments can be so correct or solid as they would have been, had our reason been mature from the moment of our birth, and had we always been guided by it alone. It is true, however, that it is not customary to pull down all the houses of a town with the single design of rebuilding them differently, and thereby rendering the streets more handsome. But it often happens that a private individual takes down his own with the view of erecting it anew, and that people are even sometimes constrained to this when their houses are in danger of falling from age, or when the foundations are insecure. With this before me by way of example, I was persuaded that it would indeed be preposterous for a private individual to think of reforming a state by fundamentally changing it throughout, and overturning it in order to set it up amended. And the same, I thought, was true of any similar project for reforming the body of the sciences, or the order of teaching them established in the schools. But as for the opinions which up to that time I had embraced, I thought that I could not do better than resolve at once to sweep them wholly away, that I might afterwards be in a position to admit either others more correct or even perhaps the same, when they had undergone the scrutiny of reason. I firmly believed that in this way I should much better succeed in the conduct of my life than if I built only upon old foundations and leaned upon principles which in my youth I had taken upon trust." End quote. He describes this project of his also in, I think it's Meditations on First Philosophy. He describes in other places this idea that as an adult, you should revisit all of your ideas that you've had up to that point and see which of them make sense and which don't, and get rid of the ones that make sense. Which on the one hand is a tall order, and it would take a lot of work, and it seems it would be very tiring. But on the other hand, if you don't do that, how can you know that anything that you think is true is true? It might be based on some assumption that got into your mind when you were 12, or that your parents conveyed to you, or some teacher that you had. That's actually a bad assumption, but that's not immediately apparent on your having the thought. You just think, I think this is right because it's right. But what's actually behind that is something very unstable, very feeble, as an explanation. Again, later describing his intention in his life, he says, quote, "I have never contemplated anything higher than the reformation of my own opinions, and basing them on a foundation wholly my own," end quote. And that's a bit of a summary of the thing that he was talking about doing before. He talks about looking to various teachers for guidance in this project, and he says, quote, "I could, however, select from the crowd no one whose opinions seemed worthy of preference, and thus I found myself constrained, as it were, to use my own reason in the conduct of my life. But like one walking alone and in the dark, I resolved to proceed so slowly and with such circumspection that if I did not advance far, I would at least guard against falling," end quote. I like that metaphor, that he tried to think as though he were walking alone and in the dark. And how would you walk if you were walking alone and in the dark? You would walk very slowly and carefully and with circumspection. Circumspection is a very nice word that, if you break it down, it means looking all around. But if you look up a definition today, it'll just say very carefully or something like that. Or maybe overly cautious. But the word is circumspection, looking all around. And his goal in thinking is then to not get very far, but to avoid falling, to avoid an error in thinking. And often, being too concerned about avoiding errors can be a bad approach. It's not very good if you're trying to be creative. If you're trying to come up with new ideas, you should just go for it and brainstorm and write down whatever comes to your mind. But if you're trying to ratiocinate, if you're trying to excogitate, if you're trying to think by careful, deliberate inference, then to do it carefully and slowly is better. Because the moment that you get off the trail and you've made a bad assumption or a bad move in your logic, everything that comes after that is now a waste. So you do not save any time by going quickly. In fact, you risk losing all of your time. If you make one mistake in your logic and then you keep going with it, then you've just wasted all the time that you spend after that. So it's actually far more efficient to go very slowly. Finally, he gets to actually describing his method. Quote, "As a multitude of laws often only hampers justice, so that a state is best governed when with few laws, these are rigidly administered. In like manner, instead of the great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the 4 following would prove perfectly sufficient for me, provided I took the firm and unwavering resolution never in a single instance to fail in observing them. The first was never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and to comprise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible and as might be necessary for its adequate solution. The third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that, by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend, by little and little, and as it were step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in a relation of antecedence and sequence. And the last, in every case to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. The long chains of simple and easy reasonings by means of which geometers are accustomed to reach the conclusions of their most difficult demonstrations had led me to imagine that all things, to the knowledge of which man is competent, are mutually connected in the same way, and that there is nothing so far removed from us as to be beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it, provided only we abstain from accepting the false for the true, and always preserve in our thoughts the order necessary for the deduction of one truth from another." End quote. That passage, where he lays out these 4 rules in his own thinking, is probably the most important passage I've read in Descartes. There are other passages that are important and good, but I think that that is the best one. If you think that way, you will not always be correct, but it is hard to imagine a mode of thinking that would make you be correct with higher frequency than doing those 4 things. And when I first read this, I was amazed that the public school system had never mentioned these 4 rules from Descartes. You could very easily teach this to high schoolers, and even if they don't get it at first, you could at least show them, and they could try it out and think about it and have it as a mode of thinking in their minds. And I'm sure there are college programs where people read them, but I even took a sort of philosophy survey course in my last semester in my undergrad. I had 1 credit left over that I could do anything that I wanted with, and so I ended up taking a philosophy survey course. And that course very easily could have had some Descartes in it. It didn't, but I imagine there are more college students who have seen these 4 rules. But the idea that the purported intention and function of the public school system is to teach children how to think, and this 1 page, really, of text cannot find its way into the curriculum is pretty astonishing. But of course, applying these maxims as an adult and re-examining every thought that you've ever had could lead to some instability. But fret not, Descartes has thought of that also and offers some guidance. He writes, quote, "And finally, as it is not enough before commencing to build the house in which we live, that it be pulled down, that materials and builders provided, or that we engage in the work ourselves according to a plan which we have beforehand carefully drawn out. But as it is likewise necessary that we be furnished with some other house in which we may live commodiously during the operations, so that I might not remain irresolute in my actions while my reason compelled me to suspend my judgment, and that I might not be prevented from living thenceforward in the greatest possible felicity, I formed a provisionary code of morals composed of 3 or 4 maxims, with which I am desirous to make you acquainted. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, adhering firmly to the faith in which, by the grace of God, I had been educated from my childhood, and regulating my conduct in every other matter according to the most moderate opinions and the farthest removed from extremes, which should happen to be adopted in practice with general consent of the most judicious of those among whom I might be living." End quote. Skipping ahead, quote, "Very many are not aware of what it is that they really believe, for, as the act of mind by which a thing is believed is different from that by which we know that we believe it, the one act is often found without the other, end quote. So he says that people often don't know what they believe because believing and knowing what you believe are distinct things. Anyway, continuing on, quote, "My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I was able, and not to adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinions when once adopted than if they had been highly certain, imitating in this the example of travelers who, when they have lost their way in a forest, ought not to wander from side to side, far less remain in one place, but proceed constantly towards the same side in as straight a line as possible without changing their direction for slight reasons, although perhaps it might be chance alone which at first determined the selection. For in this way, if they do not exactly reach the point they desire, they will come at least in the end to some place that will probably be preferable to the middle of a forest. In the same way, since in action it frequently happens that no delay is permissible, it is very certain that when it is not in our power to determine what is true, we ought to act according to what is most probable. And even although we should not remark a greater probability in one opinion than in another, we ought, notwithstanding, to choose one or the other, and afterwards consider it, in so far as it relates to practice, as no longer dubious, but manifestly true and certain, since the reason by which our choice has been determined is itself possessed of these qualities. This principle was sufficient thenceforward to rid me of all those repentings and pangs of remorse that usually disturb the consciences of such feeble and uncertain minds as, destitute of any clear and determinate principle of choice, allow themselves one day to adopt a course of action as the best, which they abandon the next as the opposite. My third maxim was to endeavor always to conquer myself rather than fortune, and change my desires rather than the order of the world, and in general accustom myself to the persuasion that, except our own thoughts, there is nothing absolutely in our power, so that when we have done our best in things external to us, all wherein we fail of success is to be held as regards us absolutely impossible. And this single principle seemed to me sufficient to prevent me from desiring for the future anything which I could not obtain, and thus render me contented. For since our will naturally seeks those objects alone which the understanding represents as in some way possible of attainment, it is plain that if we consider all external goods as equally beyond our power, we shall no more regret the absence of such goods as seem due to our birth when deprived of them, without any fault of ours, than our not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico, and thus making, so to speak, a virtue of necessity. We shall no more desire health and disease, or freedom and imprisonment, than we now do bodies incorruptible as diamonds, or the wings of birds to fly with. But I confess, there is need of prolonged discipline and frequently repeated meditation to accustom the mind to view all objects in this light. And I believe that in this chiefly consisted the secret of the power of such philosophers as in former times were enabled to rise superior to the influence of fortune, and amid suffering and poverty enjoy a happiness which their gods might have envied. For, occupied incessantly with the consideration of the limits prescribed to their power by nature, they became so entirely convinced that nothing was at their disposal except their own thoughts, that this conviction was of itself sufficient to prevent their entertaining any desire of other objects, and over their thoughts they acquired a sway so absolute that they had some ground on this account for esteeming themselves more rich and more powerful, more free and more happy than other men who, whatever be the favors heaped on them by nature and fortune, if destitute of this philosophy, can never command the realization of all their desires." End quote. So he gives 3 rules of behavior there, and these rules are as practical as the first 4 maxims about good thought are ideal and calibrated. And remember that he gave these explicitly as a kind of a placeholder while you're re-examining all your thoughts, or really just what he did while he was re-examining all of his thoughts. And they're all very solid. The first one is obey the law. The second one is, once you have made a judgment about something, to hold to that as firmly as if you were completely certain that it was true. And this might seem to contradict the skepticism that he recommends, the doubting of everything that you can see and possibly know. But this is what allows you to still have a functional life while you're doing that. Otherwise, you can't get out of bed in the morning because you say, well, how do I really know that the bed exists and that this isn't all a dream? Which he gets into later. And the third one, that he endeavors to conquer himself rather than fortune, and to change his desires rather than the order of the world. This is a very Stoic principle. This is where Descartes' skepticism connects with his Stoicism. He recommends treating everything outside of yourself as equally beyond your power, that the only thing that's really in your power is your own thoughts, and so you should tend to them very carefully and keep them in very good working order, like the tools in a workshop or the books in a very carefully arranged library. And that everything outside of you, if you think that you should have something or something doesn't go the way that you want it to, or you end up sick or in prison or whatever it might be, that your desire that not be as it is the same as your desiring that you own the kingdoms of China and Mexico. Your responsibility is to act rightly, and after that, nothing else is in your power. And I like this philosophy, and I don't like it. And I like it because it's really a good source of tranquility. It's a good worldview, both for maintaining equanimity in difficult circumstances and also for prioritizing the ordering of your mind. Both of those things I think are very good. And the reason I don't like it is that it could encourage a kind of fatalism or quietism in which you say, well, I cannot affect anything and I don't need to, so I'm just going to tend to my own thoughts. And you should certainly tend to your own thoughts at least. And if you're truly in a position where you can't do anything about your circumstances, then you can take refuge in this worldview. But if you relinquish your influence on the world or society, all you're doing is clearing the way for other people to influence it. And they don't have any more right to influence it than you do. So there's no particular reason to do that. But this is a useful view for ordinary, everyday difficulties and even extreme difficulties, like death and sickness and things like that. He then describes the satisfaction that he got in living his life according to the rules that he outlined. Quote, "It was my conviction that I could not do better than continue in that in which I was engaged, that is, in devoting my whole life to the culture of my reason, and in making the greatest progress I was able in the knowledge of truth on the principles of the method which I had prescribed to myself. This method, from the time I had begun to apply it, had been to me the source of satisfaction so intense as to lead me to believe that more perfect or more innocent could not be enjoyed in this life, and as by its means I daily discovered truths that appeared to me of some importance, and of which other men were generally ignorant, the gratification thence arising so occupied my mind that I was wholly indifferent to every other object." End quote. He then talks more about how he further purged his mind of thoughts that he believed to be incorrect. Quote, "I made it my business in each matter to reflect particularly upon what might fairly be doubted and prove a source of error. I gradually rooted out from my mind all the errors which had hitherto crept into it. Not that in this I imitated the skeptics who doubt only that they may doubt, and seek nothing beyond uncertainty itself. For, on the contrary, my design was singly to find ground of assurance, and cast aside the loose earth and sand, that I might reach the rock or the clay. In this, as appears to me, I was successful enough, for since I endeavored to discover the falsehood or incertitude of the propositions I examined, not by feeble conjectures but by clear and certain reasonings, I met with nothing so doubtful as not to yield some conclusion of adequate certainty, although this were merely the inference that the matter in question contained nothing certain." End quote. So here, too, Descartes answers a criticism that people will often have of skepticism, that it is a philosophy of arguing that you do not know anything and cannot know anything, and so why bother? And he says that his goal was not to find uncertainty, but certainty, and that this was how he went about doing it. And this is harder to do dealing with one's own life in the real world rather than the abstractions with which mathematics deals. But this is the world that we are confronting, and so we have to figure out how to do it somehow. He then writes, quote, "I had long before remarked that in relation to practice it is sometimes necessary to adopt, as if above doubt, opinions which we discern to be highly uncertain, as has been already said. But as I then desired to give my attention solely to the search after truth, I thought that a procedure exactly the opposite was called for, and that I ought to reject as absolutely false all opinions in regard to which I could suppose the least ground for doubt, in order to ascertain whether after that there remained aught in my belief that was wholly indubitable. Accordingly, seeing that our senses sometimes deceive us, I was willing to suppose that there existed nothing really such as they presented to us. And because some men err in reasoning, and fall into paralogisms, even on the simplest matters of geometry, I, convinced that I was as open to error as any other, rejected as false all the reasonings I had hitherto taken for demonstrations, and finally, when I considered that the very same thoughts, presentations, which we experience when awake may also be experienced when we are asleep, while there is at that time not one of them true, I supposed that all objects, presentations, that had ever entered into my mind when awake, had in them no more truth than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately upon this, I observed that whilst I thus wished to think that all else was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be somewhat. And as I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, was so certain, and of such evidence that no ground of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it, I concluded that I might, without scruple, accept it as the first principle of the philosophy of which I was in search." End quote. So this is the passage from which that famous phrase comes, "I think, therefore I am." And while this phrase is often used as an inexplicable riddle of philosophy, it absolutely is not that. This is an important thought that Descartes took as his anchor of something that he really truly knew. And the argument is that even though he couldn't trust his senses, because your senses often deceive you, and even though he couldn't trust his reasoning, because people are often misguided by reasoning, and he is a person, and he too could be misguided in the same way. And he could not even really trust his thoughts, because when you dream, you have thoughts that are not real. He realized that though he might not know if he's dreaming or not, or if he's deceived or not, he can know for certain that he exists because he can think, because he is at that moment conceiving of anything at all. And it's not necessarily thought in the case of thinking of something in your mind. It might just be the thought of, if you are looking out at the mountains, then you have in your mind an image of mountains. But because you have that in your mind, you must exist. The mountains might not be real. They might look different than how they appear to your eye. You might be thinking about them the wrong way. But if you have something in your mind, you must at that moment exist. And this matters because he then begins to extrapolate upward from that base. Quote, "And as I observe that in the words, 'I think, therefore I am,' there is nothing at all which gives me assurance of their truth beyond this, that I see very clearly that in order to think, it is necessary to exist, I conclude that I might take, as a general rule, the principle that all the things which we very clearly and distinctly conceive are true, only observing, however, that there is some difficulty in rightly determining the objects which we distinctly conceive." End quote. So his first maxim, his first rule of good thinking, that only take for true what you clearly and distinctly perceive, is a direct inference from this initial principle, cogito ergo sum. The next passage that I'm going to read is a bit longer. In this passage, he's talking about the public benefit for his discoveries and for his mode of thinking. He writes, quote, "I believed that I could not keep them concealed without sinning grievously against the law by which we are bound to promote, as far as in us lies, the general good of mankind. For by them I perceived it to be possible to arrive at knowledge highly useful in life, and in room of the speculative philosophy usually taught in the schools, to discover a practical, by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, as distinctly as we know the various crafts of our artisans, we might also apply them in the same way to all the uses to which they are adapted, and thus render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature." And this is a result to be desired, not only in order to the invention of an infinity of arts, by which we might be enabled to enjoy without any trouble the fruits of the earth and all its comforts, but also, and especially, for the preservation of health, which is without doubt of all the blessings of this life, the first and fundamental one. For the mind is so intimately dependent upon the condition and relation of the organs of the body, that if any means can ever be found to render men wiser and more ingenious than hitherto, I believe that it is in medicine they must be sought for. It is true that the science of medicine, as it now exists, contains few things whose utility is very remarkable. But without any wish to depreciate it, I am confident that there is no one, even among those whose profession it is, who does not admit that all at present known in it is almost nothing in comparison of what remains to be discovered. But since I designed to employ my whole life in the search after so necessary a science, and since I had fallen in with a path which seems to me such that if any one follow it, he must inevitably reach the end desired, unless he be hindered either by the shortness of life or the want of experiments, I judge that there could be no more effectual provision against these two impediments than if I were faithfully to communicate to the public all the little I might myself have found, and incite men of superior genius to strive to proceed farther by contributing, each according to his inclination and ability, to the experiments which it would be necessary to make, and also by informing the public of all they might discover, so that by the last, beginning where those before them had left off, and thus connecting the lives and labors of many, we might collectively proceed much farther than each by himself could do. I remarked, moreover, with respect to experiments, that they become always more necessary the more one is advanced in knowledge, for at the commencement it is better to make use only of what is spontaneously presented to our senses, and of which we cannot remain ignorant, provided we bestow on it any reflection, however slight, than to concern ourselves about more uncommon and recondite phenomena. The reason of which is, that the more uncommon often only mislead us, so long as the causes of the more ordinary are still unknown, and the circumstances upon which they depend are almost always so special and minute as to be highly difficult to detect." End quote. So he's anticipating the coming more formalized science. And he's writing in 1637. This is sort of in the middle of the scientific revolution, which is sort of mid-16th century to maybe late 17th century. So in a certain sense, the machine of modern science, of people recording experiments and other people looking at them and conducting new experiments based on that, the gears of this machine are just beginning to turn. And he articulates this view of people becoming the lords and possessors of nature and of inventing an infinity of arts. But especially he describes this chain by which people will add to the knowledge of their predecessors and keep going, so that instead of a bunch of isolated lives, you have them all connected by the work that they do. He writes, quote, "Afterwards, when I wished to descend to the more particular, so many diverse objects presented themselves to me that I believed it to be impossible for the human mind to distinguish the forms or species of bodies that are upon the earth from an infinity of others which might have been, if it had pleased God to place them there, or consequently to apply them to our use, unless we rise to causes through their effects, and avail ourselves of many particular experiments." End quote. So there he talks about the step at which you move from reasoning to experiment. He talks about beginning from the objects simplest and easiest to know, that's in an earlier passage. And then once you can't reason anymore about something, once it becomes too subtle, then it's time to move to an experiment to sort out what it is you're looking at. He writes, quote, "I ought indeed to go on committing to writing all the results which I deemed of any moment, as soon as I should have tested their truth, and to bestow the same care upon them as I would have done had it been my design to publish them. This course commended itself to me, as well because I thus afforded myself more ample inducement to examine them thoroughly. For doubtless that is always more narrowly scrutinized, which we believe will be read by many, than that which is written merely for our private use. And frequently what has seemed to me true when I first conceived it has appeared false when I have set about committing it to writing, as because I thus lost no opportunity of advancing the interests of the public, as far as in me lay, and since thus likewise, if my writings possess any value, those into whose hands they may fall after my death may be able to put them to what use they deem proper." End quote. So at the end there, he's talking about us, and of course, anyone else who ever benefited from Descartes' writing. But it's interesting that he acknowledges this reality that when you write something down, especially if you intend it to be read by other people, you take it more seriously than if you are just jotting notes in a notebook or just thinking by yourself. When you have to articulate it, when you have to put it into a presentable form, you have to work out a lot of the details that maybe you hadn't thought about yet. And like he said, sometimes you even find that something that you thought was true actually isn't. But you might not have noticed unless you tried to write it down and articulate it in a very clear way. This is why writing is an extension of thinking. In a brief note, he writes, quote, "I recognize my extreme liability to error, and scarce ever trust to the first thoughts which occur to me." End quote. That's really just a reiteration of Descartes' approach and perspective in general, to not trust your own thoughts, or at least the first thoughts that you have about something, and to recognize that you are as likely to make a mistake as anyone else. You're not special in that way. But there's good news, which is that the guard against that kind of error is the very careful thinking that he describes. Of people who get very into the teachings of one particular philosopher, Descartes writes, quote, "Scarcely in a single instance has any one of their disciples surpassed them, and I am quite sure that the most devoted of the present followers of Aristotle would think themselves happy if they had as much knowledge of nature as he possessed, were it even under the condition that they should never afterwards attain to higher. In this respect they are like the ivy, which never strives to rise above the tree that sustains it, and which frequently even returns downwards when it has reached the top. For it seems to me that they also sink, in other words, render themselves less wise than they would be if they gave up study, who, not contented with knowing all that is intelligibly explained in their author, desire in addition to find in him the solution of many difficulties of which he says not a word, and never perhaps so much as thought." End quote. So Descartes would not at all recommend that we become Cartesians and just study his philosophy and know it very well, because there are plenty of things that he didn't think about, or indeed that he may have thought wrongly about, which, of course, the purpose of studying any philosopher is not to take wholesale everything that they think. That's anti-philosophy. But it's a fact that not everybody's thoughts are equally valuable, and when you find someone like Descartes whose thoughts are very valuable, it's worth acknowledging and studying them. Wrapping up, he reiterates his main point and says that, quote, "The habit which they will acquire by seeking first what is easy and then passing onward slowly and step by step to the more difficult will benefit them more than all my instructions. In my own case, I am persuaded that if I had been taught from my youth all the truths of which I have since sought out demonstrations, and had thus learned them without labor, I should never perhaps have known any beyond these. At least I should never have acquired the habit and the facility which I think I possess in always discovering new truths in proportion as I give myself to the search." End quote. And this practice that he describes of first thinking about the most simple components of what you're thinking about, and then trying to gradually move to what is more complicated and switching over to experiments whenever that's necessary, is an especially good approach for the internet age. And that's because we have really an unlimited amount of information. It's not actually infinite, but it's more than you could consume in your lifetime, so it's functionally infinite. So to consume information in an undirected way would be missing the point. And that's what a lot of people do with the internet. When you're just opening up a news site or opening up social media, that's what you're doing. You're consuming information in an undirected way. But if you were to sit and think about whatever it is that interests you, whether it's a field of study, a discipline, or just a topic that you're curious about, and you were to try to reason through it in the basic components, and then once you got to a point where you couldn't reason any further, where it got too blurry, too complicated, to then move to even the internet, much less to experiments, but to then just know what you're looking for and why. Often somebody has already done that work, but you might never have found it unless you first sat and thought about what it would make sense to look for. And the last passage that I wanted to show you is the following. Quote, "Though artisans may not be able at once to execute the invention which is explained in the dioptrics, I do not think that any one on that account is entitled to condemn it. For since address and practice are required in order so to make and adjust the machines described by me as not to overlook the smallest particular, I should not be less astonished if they succeeded on the first attempt than if a person were in one day to become an accomplished performer on the guitar by merely having excellent sheets of music set up before him. And if I write in French, which is the language of my country, in preference to Latin, which is that of my preceptors, it is because I expect that those who make use of their unprejudiced natural reason will be better judges of my opinions than those who give heed to the writings of the ancients only. And as for those who unite good sense with habits of study, whom alone I desire for judges, they will not, I feel assured, be so partial to Latin as to refuse to listen to my reasonings merely because I expound them in the vulgar tongue." End quote. So there's two interesting thoughts back to back there. The first one, where he says, even if you can't do what I said you should do in my dioptrics. Dioptrics is his book about optics. He says, even if you can't yet build the machine that I described there, you'll be able to do it soon because it's very difficult. And to be able to do it all at once would be like to be able to play the guitar all at once. And him saying that sounds a little bit arrogant, and that comes through sometimes in Descartes' writings, a little bit of arrogance. But his book Dioptrics is the first articulation of the law of refraction and a pretty significant contribution to optics in general. So he might sound like he's being a little bit arrogant there, but he is justified and he was correct. The second bit is something I like to point out. I might have mentioned this earlier, that Descartes chose to write in French. And similarly, Galileo wrote in Italian, whereas in those days, writing what they wrote in Latin would have been more typical, but they both did this maybe in part to make their writing more accessible to the public, who might not necessarily have spoken Latin, but would have spoken the vernacular language, the French or Italian of their country at that time. And on the one hand, this might seem like an analogy, a metaphor for popular science today, that there are some scientists who say, oh, I would never write a popular science book. And then there are others who maybe spent a certain amount of time in the lab and then made a career as a science popularizer, as somebody who promotes and explains science to the public. And there's a temptation to say that what Galileo and Descartes did by writing in the vernacular was a kind of advocacy of popular science. And it certainly was. It was a dissemination of knowledge, a spreading out, a not keeping it siloed only in this small group of people who spoke Latin. But the fact is that today, academic science articles are published in the language of the country that they're published in usually. I know that in some other countries, they also will translate them into English in order to let the article have more reach, but initially it's published in the language of the country. And that means that anybody who speaks that language and has the patience to try to understand what the article is saying, and more importantly, to go through the years of study to understand it, they can access it. And also keep in mind that in Descartes' day, people spoke French, but a much smaller proportion of people could read it. But anyway, Descartes wrote in French, and that was unusual for the time, and it made it easier for more people to access his writing. Whether that pairs with popular science today is sort of secondary. So those are the passages from Descartes that I wanted to show you. I hope that what I value about Descartes' writing came through, and it's something useful that you can maybe apply in your life. I know I try to apply some of his principles in mine. And if this was interesting to you, I definitely recommend you read Discourse on Method. It's not very long, and there's other interesting stuff in it. And as far as other Descartes writing goes, you could check out Meditations on First Philosophy and Principles of Philosophy, which are similar. All of these are very short, though they're not very quick reading. You want to read them carefully. And if you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll go to my website, vollrathpublishing.com, VOLLRATH publishing.com, and buy some books. Someday maybe I'll talk a little bit more about my publishing experience in general, but I am very pleased with how this book came out. This edition of Frankenstein that I printed, starting up this company, was a calculated experiment. I have a lot of book publishing experience, but I had never printed something on my own before, from beginning to end, from start to finish. And I did it with this, and I think it came out very good. The print quality of the book is excellent. I'm very proud of it. I can offer it at a very good price. I have a copy on my bookshelf, and if I saw my edition side by side with a few other editions, the typical Frankenstein editions that you see in stores, I would definitely pick mine, even if it weren't mine. So I hope you'll go and buy yourself a copy. I offer free shipping anywhere in the United States. Buy a copy for yourself, for your friends, for your family. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an excellent book. If you haven't read it, you absolutely should. It's not very long, 270 pages, very easy to read. If you're not a big classics reader yet, though if you just listen to this entire Descartes podcast, you almost certainly are. But if you aren't yet, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an awesome way to get into it, or if you want to get somebody else into classics, it's a great place to start. It's very action-packed from start to finish. It's not long. You get a good return on your investment. There's a lot to think about, a lot to talk about afterwards. Makes a great discussion group book. I actually picked it as my first publishing project because I read it for the first time a few years ago, and I was amazed at how good it is. There are so many cartoonish depictions of the monster in various movies and on various book covers that you think that it's going to be something that was novel at the time but is sort of overdone now, but it's absolutely not. There's as much in it for today, maybe more even for today, because now we've seen the progress of technology and what can result from it. I think it's become even more relevant with age. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll go and pick up a book or two. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.